Hello everyone, I hope you guys are all doing well. I hope you're staying safe and healthy. I hope you're practicing social distancing. I hope you're washing your hands thoroughly. So this is the beginning of a new era of our semester. Please be gentle with me. I've never done a recorded lecture before. So this is going to go along with the lecture on social welfare history that we were supposed to have last week before the technology failed us. I'm abbreviating it a lot. As you recall, I had 14 and a half pages of notes on what this lecture is supposed to be. I'm only going to be doing about 20 to 30 minutes at most because I don't think most people have more of an attention span than that. So what we are going to be talking about is kind of looking at how history impacts the values that are represented in our social welfare policies. I want you, as I talk, to really think about the role of religion in social welfare, both in antiquity, back in the good old days, and back in today in the modern era. I want you to think about the political economic spectrum and the different values and theories that influence policies. So the basic tenets and programs of a social welfare system reflect the values of the society in which we live. We've talked about that. That policy is a reflection of the values of our society. Social welfare systems don't arise in a vacuum. They don't just come into being like this. They come out of customs and practices and laws and rules of the past, kind of judging what has worked and what hasn't worked and what's been effective. And we can't really understand how we've gotten to where we are right now without understanding the past and sort of what has informed what we do today in terms of welfare. So going way back in time, we're actually going back to the year 2000 BC for a moment. Back in the year 2000 BC in ancient Babylon, the rules of Hammurabi made the protection of widows and orphans and the protection of the weak against the strong. Back in the year 400 BC, Buddhism encouraged charity. In the years 384 to 322 BC, Aristotle said it is more blessed to give than to receive. And that's something that we always say around Christmas time, right? I prefer giving over receiving. In the year 106 BC to 43, Cicero said, justice commands us to have mercy on all, to give everyone his due. And it's interesting to know that the words philanthropy and charity are of Greek and Roman origin. Back in those days, the ancient Romans and Greeks often had pensions for the crippled. They had public distribution of grain and other food for the needy, and they had institutions to care for orphans. Now that's great, but they also had slavery, infanticide, concubines, and euthanasia for people just because they didn't want them around. So we had some good and some bad, just like today. The Torah, which is the Old Testament, the Talmud of ancient Jewish law, the New Testament, and the Decretum Catholic decrees all say all of poverty is not a crime and that discretion was to be observed in bestowing assistance. So religious documents support the concept that careful rules must be elaborated on to discriminate amongst the various classes of needy people. So for instance, this comes out of scripture that says a man's first responsibility, you notice it says a man's first responsibility is to his family, especially his parents, then to his neighbors, then after that strangers. So from the very beginning, we have had religious doctrine telling us to take care of our own first, and that if people were not part of our family, then they just weren't that important, which is the sort of self-determination that we're seeing even today in the days when people are basically stockpiling toilet paper and hand sanitizer, not so much because they need it, but to make sure that their neighbors can't get it. So back since ancient times, we saw that the needy had a right to assistance and that people who were better off had a duty to provide it. The thing is, though, back in the day, there was very little need to establish formal social services. Because there was some poverty, it wasn't an institutional social problem. It wasn't a structural issue. People could depend on others for mutual aid, so they could get help from other family members. They could get aid from friends. People were more self-sufficient and they grew their own food. They raised livestock and things like that. But then what happened was, by the 4th century, that's the 300s, travel was a lot easier. So people became more wealthy as they could engage in trade. People started to own land. And then when poverty and the haves and have-nots became more clear-cut, the church began to establish formal systems of charity. By the 6th century, so that's the 500s, monasteries served as basic relief agencies, especially in rural areas. Feudalism, which you may recall from history class back in the day, was a set of laws in medieval Europe that basically had landowners and their servants that worked the land. And the deal was that the landowners or the lords were, they depended on their serfs to provide all of their, all of their meat, all of their livestock, all of their crops. But they also, in return, protected their serfs, and they were guaranteed a certain level of welfare from their lords. And of course, the serfs had very limited freedom, but they kind of knew that they would have all their needs taken care of. They were taken care of in terms of sickness, unemployment. They knew they'd be taken care of in old age. So it was a trade-off of having all of your needs basically accounted for and taken care of, but not having much freedom to do what you wanted to do. Your job was basically to do what was needed to maintain the serfdom. So people who did need assistance, who were not serfs, relied on the church. So bishops back then were charged with the duty of feeding and protecting the poor within each of their districts. Those who in the church, which at the time was a public institution, had to pay a compulsory tax. So relief was carried out in local communities and given only to those experiencing poverty because of accident, illness, or death. So then, and this is interesting to talk about considering everything going on, 1348, the Black Death killed almost a third of England's population, which produced a lot of hardship and suffering. At that time, feudalism ended. People had their individual freedom, but there was a lot of social disorder. There was a lot of uncertainty and serious hardship for a lot of people, especially agricultural laborers who their only skill was working the lands that their lords provided them to work, and now that was gone. They were forced away from their lords' lands. So with all this happened, Europe at this point, and again, we're talking about the mid-1300s, is an absolute mess. You have lots of poverty, vagabondage, begging, thievery, especially in urban and commercial centers like London. By the mid-14th century, the state had to intervene. So King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers a year after the plague, which fixed maximum wages. It placed travel restrictions on people who were not employed. It forbade the giving of charity to sturdy and valiant alms seekers. So this is important because this said that all able-bodied persons were forced to work in their place of residence at a rate of wages that were fixed by law. So even if there was a shortage of labor and their skills were needed more, they could only make a certain amount, which still was not quite enough to have a good life. So, and the problem was, with the Black Death, again, it killed a third of the population of England. There was a real need for labor, but people who were in demand could still only get that small amount that they were entitled to. And it's also important to note that this sort of began the concept of who was worthy of charity, and that was able-bodied people. At the time, able-bodied people meant that you had all four limbs and could basically walk. It did not account for any other sorts of disorders. It did not account for any sort of, as we would call now, invisible illnesses. It did not account for any mental illnesses or cognitive disabilities. If you had all four working limbs, you could work and you were not worthy of any charity. So the growth of commerce and international trade and the rise of a money economy, which is kind of where capitalism started, influenced the incidence of poverty. So now in the 1500s, in England, Parliament passed a statute that provided severe punishment for able-bodied beggars. So people who, for whatever reason, were considered to be able-bodied and were asking for help were brought to the marketplace and were to be tied to the end of a cart naked and be beaten with whips until bleeding. So that was the first moral punishment for somebody deemed able-bodied to request any sort of charity or assistance. The law also decreed that mayors, justices of the peace, and other local officials shall make diligent search and inquiry of all aged, poor, and impotent persons which live or of necessity be compelled to live by alms of the charity of people, and assign such people areas where they may beg. So this further not only determined who was able-bodied, but it gave people the right to beg, but it also said that if you are out there and you're asking for charity, we basically have the right to interrogate you and make absolutely sure that you're not faking it. It also allowed for cruel punishment of beggars. Beggars could be branded, beggars could be enslaved, and in some cases, beggars were executed by the government. Authorities could take children between the ages of 5 and 14 to be indentured servants in order to give their parents money. And public officials could obtain resources through voluntary contributions collected in churches. Those were to care for the poor, the lame, the sick, and the aged. So they wanted to start setting up an actual system so people didn't have to beg. The problem is that it made the assumption that people were going to voluntarily give their money, which, as we know today, isn't something that happens very readily. They did start also realizing that people who are able-bodied, just because you had all four limbs, it didn't mean that you could find employment, which is still something that we see to this day. So the Henrician Poor Law, which is what that was called, required that the state, through civil and church authorities, assume legal responsibility for relief of its poor, old and young, disabled and able-bodied alike. At the time, it was a serious attempt to cope with the economic and social problems of the age. So then in 1572, the government had to institute the first formal taxation system. They instituted an overseer of the poor, charged with the duty of providing work relief for the able-bodied and unemployed. The Protestant Reformation in 1536 was a reaction to the corruption and decay of the church, and it resulted in all those monasteries that were providing relief being dissolved. That was Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Henry VIII. And interestingly, you may have heard of the Church of England. Henry VIII was originally Catholic, but he wanted one of his many divorces, and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow it. So he actually created the Church of England just for the purposes of being allowed to get a divorce. So by the end of the late 16th century, the government perceived that punitive measures directed at vagrants and beggars were not sufficient to preserve order. And they're realizing maybe poverty is a structural issue and an economic issue rather than a personal or moral issue. And the state may have that the responsibility to help people who cannot provide for themselves. So they started instituting more measures to help people who were dealing with poverty. The Poor Law of 1601 was enacted because in the 1590s there was a great deal of food scarcity and widespread famine, inflation, high prices, insecurity, and great suffering. And England had to act because at the time England had no army, they had no formal military, and the lawmakers were worried about all of the poor uprising and overthrowing the government. So they said the way to stop the poor people from getting angry enough to turn violent is to start providing a formal system of care for the poorest people. So the Poor Law of 1601 actually stayed in effect for almost 250 years. And under that law, parents were legally liable for support of their children and grandchildren. Children were responsible for the care of needy parents and grandparents. Vagrants who refused work and could work could be committed to a house of correction, whipped, branded, publicly stoned, or even executed. The law did not allow for any appeal. It also assumed the state had a responsibility to supplement ordinary efforts to relieve want and suffering and ensure maintenance of life. It did concede that there were helpless or needy people who deserved assistance and had a legal right to it. It created three major categories of dependents: the children, the able-bodied, and the impotent. And the authorities were required to adapt activities to the needs of each. So children were given apprenticeships so that they could develop job skills. The able-bodied were given work. For incapacitated, helpless, or the worthy poor, which again are basically your women, your widows, either indoor or outdoor relief. Indoor relief were almshouses, actual poor houses that people lived in. Outdoor relief was if you had a home, they would come and bring you assistance in your home. The non-deserving poor were often sent to workhouses where they had to do menial work in return for only the bare necessities to live. Recipients had to meet very stringent residency requirements. So basically, if you lived in an area where you were getting support, if you left that area, you were not entitled to any support. And if you went to a new area, they were not required to give you support. So now we sort of pivot to the US. Throughout the 18th century, US labor was at a premium. So unemployment was not a major social issue. The system of land tenure allowed people without property to acquire it, and a lot of people could live off the land. However, a lot of people who came to America were of moderate or poor means. You had what were called rogues, convicts, political prisoners, beggars, vagrants, orphans, unemployed, who were shipped to America by the English government. So at the time, England shipped a lot of the people to the US that it didn't necessarily want, which is similar to what it did in Australia, which began as a colony of convicts. So as more and more people came to the US and they had, a lot of issues, the people who lived here, the colonists, knew they had to address what was going on. So they actually started modeling their relief after the Elizabethan Poor Law with those strict residency requirements. And when newcomers would come to town, they would basically and physically drive them out of town because they didn't want to take on the issues of people that were not from their community, if that sounds familiar to you. So social theory and theology, which says that God orders society with the high and eminent in power, indignity at the top, and the poor inferior at the bottom, gave meaning to poverty in colonial America. So the root of how we perceive poverty in our country comes from religion, that basically says that the people that are at the top of the food chain are there because God favors them. So the poor are to be pitied and helped. The colonial assemblies acknowledged public responsibility for people unable to take care of themselves. So what they did was they started making local taxpayers responsible for the people within their communities. So local towns were charged with collecting taxes to care for the poor, which usually involved free health care. And as the number of people without means increased, we see the beginning of residency requirements as people would move from place to place. So some examples. In 1642, the Plymouth Colony originated residency requirements for entitlement to public assistance. In 1646, the Virginia Colony ordered folks to compulsory labor. In 1692, Massachusetts, they would physically punish people by whipping who they saw as idle. So they did a few things. They gave apprenticeship that was given to orphans and young adults. It didn't cost much for the towns. It provided training. And it provided a family with cheap labor. So, for instance, a blacksmith family could take on a child to apprentice. They would get cheap labor out of the child, and the child would learn a trade that he could then use later in life. And black people, the slaves, were the responsibility of masters and were prohibited from receiving any aid. So from the beginning, we see that black people were not deserving of aid in the United States. If there were people with mental illnesses, they were boarded at the public's expense in the homes of other people until public institutions, insane asylums, began to appear. So then that was in the 1600s. We get to the American Revolution in 1776. Many social changes occurred and occurred very rapidly. You had large-scale immigration, rapid industrialization, capitalism, the spread of wage labor, a lot of urbanization, which all bring increases in poverty and increase in disparities in wealth and income. So it became very evident at that time that the system of poor laws that we adopted from England were ineffective and not equitable. You start seeing a rise in what you may remember the laissez-faire philosophy, basically meaning government hands-off. Classic economists believed in possession and accumulation of property and wealth, which is a natural right. The state should not interfere, which is something that continues to this day. So then in America, we start seeing a lot of stereotyping of what poor people look like and what rich people look like, as well as who is the worthy poor and who is the unworthy poor. A quote that came out of that time was, "No man who is temperate, frugal, and willing to work need suffer or become a pauper for want of employment." So they're basically saying if you are an able-bodied man and you don't have a job, it's a moral problem on your part. So temperate meaning that you are of good nature, you're not drinking, you're not engaging in vices. Frugal, you're not wasteful with your money, and willing to work. So they're basically saying that if you do those things and you still can't get a job that supports you, you're doing something wrong. They also said the sober and able-bodied, if industriously disposed, cannot long want employment. They cannot, but in their own folly and vices, long remain indigent. Outdoor relief was very unpopular. The more paupers you support, the more you will have to support. Again, concepts that we still hear to this day, basically saying the more people that you put on welfare, the more people are going to want to be on welfare because they want to be supported. So what's not in any of these concepts is recognition of the economic and structural causes of poverty, depressions, recessions, inadequacy and uncertain wages, the rise in immigration. Between 1800 and 1860, there was an increase in the citizenship of the United States of over 6 million people, which, considering that it was a sparsely populated nation from the beginning, that was a lot of people. It started the beginning of the Protestant work ethic, basically saying the individual had the power to achieve economic success through their own efforts. Because of a shift in thinking like that, people were warned against giving charity. They said if you eliminate public assistance, it's going to end pauperism because people are going to have no choice but to go get work and support themselves. If you provide relief of the poor only through private charities, the poor couldn't claim it as a right or entitlement. So that was it was proposed to do away with all of these entitlements. It didn't happen. Instead, more emphasis was placed on the almshouses and workhouses, so just like in England. Public assistance was confined to only institutional care for the worthy poor. For the permanently disabled, able-bodied and unworthy poor would be institutionalized in workhouses where their behavior was controlled and they would not be tempted by vices. They would auction off poor people to families that were willing to care for them at the lowest cost. They could place the poor and sick under the supervision of couples willing to care for them at low cost. Home relief, what they saw was the cause of people wanting to stay on the welfare system. And almshouses were something that you saw a rise of in both county and state almshouses. Families were not kept intact. There was very little regard paid to the type of care provided within the almshouses. There were terrible living conditions for most of them. Some of them had really great conditions. Some of them gave really good care. The thing was that almshouses did not reform or cure anybody. They basically just proliferated poverty. They did not teach any skills. And they were very overcrowded and could actually cause spread of diseases. There was no social distancing in almshouses. So every year, the number of people who were poor and indigent increased, as did taxes to help relieve the problem. Relief for the poor consumed between 10 and 35% of all municipal funds, which was the single largest annual outlay and was believed to be the major cause of the American Revolution. So let me skip ahead a little bit. We're going to skip ahead to the Civil War. The Civil War came and it created huge relief problems that could not be blamed on individuals or families. So we have a lot of people who are dead from the war. We have a lot of widowed women with children. Slaves have been emancipated and are now trying to find their way while they live in poverty. And shockingly, the end of formal slavery was not the end of the racism that accompanied slavery. So you have millions of now freed Black folks who were living in poverty, and at the same time that, widows and people who were returning from war were trying to sort of gain a foothold in the new country. All of these freed slaves were also trying to find their own way while combating the racism that basically accompanied everything that they did. So the war did arouse charitable giving. Laws were enacted to raise funds for the relief of the sick, the destitute, wounded soldiers and their families, widows and orphans. And it was actually when we instituted what now looks like the VA system, the Homes for Disabled Veterans. So that started right after the Civil War. So they started they did a temporary reversal on the charitable practices that were the norm at the time. They began direct public aid on a grand scale, funded by the government. You saw a rise in sanitation work to bring an end to disease and death from poor sanitation, which was the U.S. Sanitary Commission, as well as a rise in women working towards a career of charity and social service. The war also demonstrated that the national government was supreme and state governments subordinate, which drew states together to introduce better coordination of state and government powers. So then after the war, there's a massive expansion of production in the U.S., which was good in one way, but it had huge consequences. Again, it created a much larger disparity in the wealthy versus the poor. There was more urbanization and immigration. There were periodic cycles of depression and unemployment, with a small group of men controlling national resources and modes of production. Again, pretty much what we're seeing today. Wretched living and working conditions, a high incidence of industrial accidents and fatalities. So I don't know if you recall, you probably, while you were in high school, read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. That was an expose of the meatpacking industry and child labor back in the days after the Civil War. And it was the expose of the jungle that actually started an inspection and a review of labor practices and a call for protection of workers. So in the late 1800s saw the birth of Society for the Prevention of Pauperism. and a lot of private charity organization societies that started providing private charities. You again had the philosophies of Calvinism, the Protestant work ethic, the social Darwinism. So scientific charities involved the study of the causes of social problems and methods to address them. So there were a lot of private charities that were working with scientists who were looking to say, why are so many people living in poverty? So slowly studies came in that said that those charitable organizations didn't work, that the causes of poverty were not individual moral failings, but rather they were lack of employment, illness, accidents. Very rarely was it what was called intemperance or, again, moral failing by individual people. So they started to see that it wasn't the person that had to be reformed, it was the environment in which they were trying to live. So friendly visitors emphasized individual and moral causes of poverty and wanted to eliminate dependency on charity. They did not believe in giving alms. Their efforts of the friendly visitors were not effective in alleviating poverty because, again, they didn't understand why poverty was such a big deal. So from 1870 to 1920, you had rapid industrialization, heavy immigration. Settlement houses provided shelter for a lot of people who entered urban areas. To finance early welfare system, political campaigns gave cash and supplies in return for the poor's votes. So if you have ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, that was actually what was happening during that movie, was basically purchasing people's votes in exchange for alleviating some of the burden of poverty from them. So remember, at this time, these cities, the urban centers, are filthy and disorderly. They are full of disease. Streets are unpaved. Horses are the primary mode of transportation, and of course the horses are crapping all over the streets. There are not adequate sewers. In some cities there was no sewer system, there was no trash pickup. People used outhouses for bathrooms. There were open slaughterhouses, and as somebody who lived in Texas in cattle country, if you have never been in the proximity of a slaughterhouse, you have no idea how bad the stink is. Fertilizing plants, there were plagues of smallpox, cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, diphtheria, scarlet fever. From all of those diseases, because you had so many people in unsanitary conditions packed into tight spaces, you had high death rates, especially for the children. So by the middle of the 19th century, the nation's first major sanitation program began. So as of 1860, 1 in every 6 people lived in the cities. By 1900, it was 1 of every 3. By 1920, half of all people in the United States lived in urban centers. Of those people, 5 out of every 6 lived huddled together in tenements. The population density was 330,000 people per square mile at the turn of the century. Today, on average, it's 27,532. So imagine how crowded places like New York City and LA are right now, and multiply that times more than 10. And that's how crowded those urban centers were back at the turn of the century. So people left farms, they migrated to cities, emancipated slaves began moving north. Between 1900 and 1910, 9 million people migrated. Between 1860 and 1900, it was 14 million. By 1900, 3/4 of Chicago's population was foreign-born. The number of Italians who were living in New York City equaled those of the number of Italians living in Naples, Italy. There were more Irish people in New York City than in Dublin, Ireland. So think about the fact that as all of this is going on, a lot of these religious societies are saying moral reform and prayer is going to end poverty. Has that worked yet? Have all the thoughts and prayers after all of these disasters done a thing to help? No. So a lot of these people became unskilled laborers in the cities. They couldn't buy land or farm it or buy equipment because they were poor. Wages were incredibly low because there were so many people who were vying for jobs. So wages were very low. Again, sanitation was awful. There was almost no upward mobility. So in reaction to the needs of the people living in urban areas and in reaction to ineffective charity movements, the settlement house movement began. So that movement originated in England amongst intellectualists and Christian socialists. That damn socialism. In America, it was patterned after Toynbee Hall, established in East London in 1884. This is where Jane Addams comes into play, who I know you've heard of as one of the pioneers of social work. In 1890, there were only 4 settlement houses. By 1910, there were 400. The average settlement house worker was about 25 years old, single, well-to-do, native-born Americans who graduated from college. Most of them were from the Northeast or the Midwest, far removed from the slums. Women finally were able to apply college degrees. Some other residents would include journalists, who were also called muckrakers at the time, novelists, and students. So it was people who really had no idea what it was like to grow up and exist in poverty that came as, good Samaritan saviors to try to address the issue of poverty in urban centers. So the settlement house movement had no well-defined goal or method. Instead, they relied on the 3 R's: residence, research, and reform. The first step was establishing good relationships with neighbors to work together to solve problems. So from the settlement house movement came the first kindergarten programs, nursery and daycare centers so working moms could leave their children, the first clubs, arts and crafts courses, libraries and gyms, penny savings bank, employment bureaus, kitchens, music halls, dispensaries or pharmacies, and schools and citizenship for recent immigrants. So the lasting effects of the settlement house movement were that residents produced a body of literature on urban ills and tenement life, making many citizens aware of how the other half lived. The research piece enabled residents to identify the true causes of poverty, the underprivileged, and oppression. And it did not initiate the reform movement, though it contributed significantly to it in terms of meeting places, lectures, discussion centers, advocacy, and it included Black folks. So they served as an important part of the creation of the NAACP and the National Urban League. The movement improved neighborhoods, it created public parks and playgrounds, established better public health facilities, supported improved garbage collection, tenement laws, enforcement of laws, so that's laws on how many people can occupy dwellings, school curriculum, and political reform. It took a while, but the settlement house movement did provide some positive change in the United States. So I'm actually going to stop with that here because some of the stuff that happened around the Depression, we are actually going to address in the next lecture. So thank you for your patience with me. Hopefully this lecture format works for you. And let me know if you need any help, support, or information. I hope you're doing well. Again, social distance, wash your damn hands.